We're delighted to welcome Professor Sarah Churchwell to the Three Muckrakers podcast. Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Your latest book is about Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and it would seem to me that this is still an extremely prescient text in terms of being a comment on modern America and the American dream. I mean, how would you situate the book in terms of relevance for contemporary society?
Well, I just wrote 400 pages on that, so I'll try to give you the short version.
Okay.
Prescience is the word. Fitzgerald sees in the middle of the boom that is the 1920s, he sees what is happening to an America that is giving itself over solely to the chasing of money and the chasing of status, and he recognizes that what that is going to do is hollow out all of the higher hopes of America, that it would be a place where people could realize their best selves, not necessarily just make a lot of money.
Sure. You've lived in the UK for 15 years now. So what do you think are the main differences in terms of attitude to politics from here to America? Do you see a big difference?
Oh yeah. I don't know if I can characterize it easily though. I mean, I think that for all of the complications and complexities in British political life today, it is, from my point of view, and it's one of the reasons I have stayed here, remains a considerably more civil society. There is a much greater sense of a common good and of a shared project, a shared cultural civic project that is the country, and I think that there is a more tolerance of political difference. There is more recognition of the importance of a robust public debate, and of course a couple of the really great decisions that you made as a society, which I trust you will never reverse, were to limit campaign finance and particularly to make sure that that there's no negative advertising and that everybody gets equal space on TV and broadcasting, so that you don't have the situation that you have in America of people buying political space. So the thing about lobbying in America is that it has also created this very toxic public discourse. The public sphere has become poisoned by that process, and I think you've managed to keep your public sphere, although it is problematic, it is a considerably more constructive space than what we have in America right now.
Sure. So we just had the US midterms, which was terrible for the Democrats, and that's putting it mildly. And it's from a British perspective, at times it just seems that America seems to vote against its own interests. It votes ideologically rather than practically, okay? So do you think that America is more polarized than ever? Yeah,
I do. It's certainly more polarized than it has been in modern history. It's definitely more polarized than it has been since
maybe Clinton or?
No, much longer than that. I'm going all the way back down through the 20th century and trying to think of a time when I think the last time it was more polarized was the Civil War.
Right.
It was polarized in the 20s, but not politically.
Sure.
Politically in the 20s, it was a Republican government for a decade. The last time we had this kind of real ideological difference that could not seem to be resolved, I think, was the Civil War.
Right.
And before that, it was the American Revolution, which of course was also a civil war.
So you'd even go past like the 1970s and the sort of
culture? Yeah, I would actually, because I think that anger was it was very of the anger of the Vietnam War and Watergate. What happened was that with the Vietnam War, sure, that it was very divided, but it was very divided on one specific issue, and there was still a fair amount of sense that the country was coming together and had shared values about other issues. So that was a very divisive. The Vietnam War and the kind of hippies versus squares, sexual cultural revolution was a very divisive event, but it was a specific event. Now we seem to, and once that was resolved, the country kind of tried to move forward, and then Watergate actually, in a funny way, brought the country together because it was united in protest against what was happening, against the corruption of government. Now you have something where I can't imagine anything that would unite these two groups. They absolutely refuse to listen to each other or to have any kind of civil discourse at all.
And a lot of people blame President Obama directly for that, but in a way I have a kind of theory that you have to go back to kind of 9/11 first of all, and then the way in which George W. Bush got into office and the whole fraud,
coup d'etat.
against Gore and everything like that, and then obviously the reaction from the Democrats was to vote in a black president. So suddenly you've got the Democrats, because of Bush, have gone this way, and the Republicans, because of Obama, have gone this way. And that set up that polarization over a period of time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's exacerbated it. I mean, I think the polarization predates Bush v. Gore, but it's certainly made it worse. And then the series of fallouts that we've had since then, all kinds of things have pushed things farther apart. It is incredibly short-sighted to blame Obama. Obama is a symptom of a much deeper and more problematic system. Because to blame him is to suggest that until 2008 everything was fine, and that's ludicrous.
Yeah. So. What do you think about the public's apathy in Britain now, I'm talking about, to the main parties, and perhaps on the back of that, the rise of UKIP? How do you see that from an American perspective?
Well, I understand. I mean, it seems to me very understandable. I share some of it myself. The problem is when you've got three parties, all of whom are going to implement exactly the same policies, no matter who you vote for, of course you're going to feel apathetic. I mean, even just looking from the point of view of those of us involved in universities, and I actually think it's extraordinary the way that Cameron has managed to get away with, actually Labour has managed to get away with too, with blaming the Lib Dems for a policy that was a Labour initiative that the Tories implemented, and the Lib Dems have taken the blame for it. I find that absolutely extraordinary. But the fact is any one of those three parties were all going to implement tuition fees, and Labour has gotten off scot-free from that. But those of us in universities when Labour in power know that they were planning to do this. The Brown Report was commissioned by them. They created this policy. So that's just one example that is close to our hearts and that we work within and work with on a daily basis. From my point of view, there's extremely little to choose between them. They're all neoliberals, and that's what we have. We have this neoliberal, that one, or that one. So the policies aren't changing. There's just different faces of what austerity is going to look like, and different faces of what greed is going to look like, and different faces of how you bail out the bankers. And none of them are actually offering a different perspective. And so, of course, people feel apathetic. It's common sense.
And do you think that the solution to this may be what's been touted in terms of further devolution of powers, whether it's national devolution, if you think about Scotland and Wales, or regional devolution, or even the potential for the UK to leave the EU?
No, I think that to me is a disintegration in the name of creating activity that I'm not sure that you need. This will sound complacent, and I'm not complacent. I think we need a much more vigorous exercise of democratic rights, to say the least. But I actually think that that in some sense, what this looks like is what a centrist government and a kind of consensus government looks like. Actually, apathy is a response to a fairly stable place, and so I think it's a human nature to say there's not a lot to choose between, but actually there's also a certain amount of stability and security here. This is what peace looks like, and I'm not sure that disintegrating things further just in order to create activity is necessarily the answer. What we do want is for people to understand that within that kind of stable political system, there is room for more energy and for people not to let cynicism get the better of them and to come in and say, actually, there is still a lot of room for fine-tuning things, for arguing over real policies, for saying, okay, we've all agreed that, again, to go use the university's examples, we've all agreed that actually the state can't afford to fund everyone, forever, to get, tertiary degrees and then postgraduate degrees. And some of us might say that, some of us who are Americans might say that's not totally unreasonable because the tax funds can't pay for everything all the time. So say you have got to cut it off somewhere.
Sure.
If we can agree consensually where that will be and then have a constructive conversation about how to fund that realistically. But everything's become very resentful and everything's become people feel entitled to certain things that are being stripped back. So I think what you have to do is change the discourse, not change the political body. I don't want to see the country break up. I want to see people turning the conversation around and finding more constructive ways of talking about it.
Sarah Churchwell, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Sarah Churchwell, interviewed by our very own Dr. Dario Llinares. I really found that fascinating, Dario. I mean, civil society, common good, tolerance, robust public debate. Wouldn't we like to see that for real everywhere? It just seems to dovetail very nicely in what we talked about in the previous segment. What was your experience of Dr. Churchwell?
Well, she was absolutely great. She came down and did an awful lot for us. Spoke a lot about politics for the muckrakers, for example. But then, spoke very, very insightfully and clearly on literature and on film and on the arts, and was, somebody who was really, really engaging in lots of different areas, and you can really see why she's got the position that she has in terms of being a sort of public intellectual, and is in the media quite a lot because she knows how to articulate these points.
And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to hear the entire interview runs about 25 minutes. It's really fascinating. Dario has put it up, and it also has video on his website. That's DarioLlinares.com. And it really, truly is a fabulous interview. What did you think, Phil?
Fascinating. I thought he did a fantastic job. As a professional interviewer in my old life, I thought you did a terrific job, Dario. And what I thought was really, really interesting was when she touched on this apathy, that people feel apathetic about voting because basically all politicians are the same. You get slightly left, slightly right. It's all about management. It's all, as she put it, neoliberalism. And so people are apathetic because there's nothing to choose between them. I thought that was interesting.
It was interesting, though, that she acknowledged that that's what a kind of peaceful society looks like in a way, that actually there's a sort of narrowing of the viewpoints, and there's a greater consensus in the centre. So therefore there's less sort of polarizing views, and therefore we tend to kind of criticize that. But in a sense, it's an offshoot of years of peace and political consensus in a way.
Yeah, it was interesting. All I could think of is when she was talking about the fact that here we are in a peaceful society and things are going well. People tend not to vote. Is that why people didn't vote in the U.S. midterms? I mean, they only had a 32% turnout, but I tend to think there's a bit more polarization involved there. But
I would agree. And I think it's interesting that she talked at the beginning about the polarization and went right back to the Civil War. I mean, she thinks that the polarization right now is stronger than in the 60s and the 70s, which is a really interesting point.
I thought that was interesting. I mean, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. I mean, the polarization in America, particularly in the 60s, was so acute, and indeed in Britain in the 80s was incredibly acute. Thatcher pushed through her policies, which were incredibly radical. In America, the polarization in the 60s was amazingly drastic. And to go back to the Civil War, very interesting. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the one signature moment in the Johnson administration, which from our discussion I think would have happened 6 years before she was even born, and that was the signing of the Civil Rights and the Voting Acts in 1964. Johnson even said at that moment, "I fear that I have lost the South for the Democrats for the next several generations because of the divisiveness of race in the United States." So I think that there have been plenty of moments post-Civil War related to black slaves as free men being able to do as they wish and move forward that caused all kinds of problems.
Are you saying you all Giffers know it all? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. Of course we do. We're muckrakers. We know it all. But it was a fascinating interview. I especially loved the discussion of tuition fees, when she said, Labour slipped it through the Tories program that the Lib Dems implemented, and they all got tart. I mean, that was...
They're all blaming the Lib Dems.
They're all brilliant. It's absolutely